Hello everybody, this is Mr. Gross. Going to talk to you today about understanding inheritance patterns, particularly pedigree charts. These little family trees that can be used to tell us what pattern certain genes follow, whether they're dominant or recessive or incompletely dominant, or in some cases what we call sex linked. We're going to break our presentation today down into a couple parts. First, we're going to go over some background and look at karyotypes, chromosomes, where those genes are, and what are the inheritance patterns that we understand. Then we're going to break our pedigree talk into three parts. In part one, we're going to go over the symbols of a pedigree chart and how to interpret them. In part two, we're going to talk about how to determine whether or not a trait is autosomal or sex-linked, and what that is. And in part three, we're going to go over how to determine if a trait is dominant or recessive. And then we'll talk about a little bit of summary. I suggest that as we go through the presentation, you get out your journal, open to a clean page and label it, pedigree notes, and then you can just sort of watch the video and take some notes, and then afterwards there'll be some practice applications. Here we go. First, in terms of background, we need to understand that humans have 46 total chromosomes in every cell in that nucleus. But all of the chromosomes that are normal pairs are what we call autosomes. So that autosome refers to those normal chromosomes. Basically, chromosomes 1 to 22 are called autosomes. And then the very last pair of chromosomes, which in this case are two X's, are called the sex chromosomes. And so genes that are located on, for example, chromosome number 7, if we had a gene on there, that would be called an autosomal gene because it's on a normal chromosome. Now, if we had a gene on the X chromosome, it would be called sex linked. Now that is significant because in the case of males, if this were a karyotype of a male, we'd see a little X chromosome, well actually a large X chromosome, and then we'd see a little Y chromosome. And the difference is the X chromosome will carry a certain gene. The Y chromosome doesn't. It's much smaller. There is no gene there. And so in fact, a person who has a sex-linked trait, in the case of males, only gets one copy. Okay. We also need to know what are all of these inheritance patterns that we could possibly have. And there are more than are listed here, but we need to know that traits can be what's called autosomal dominant. They can be autosomal recessive. They can have what's called incomplete dominance, which we also sometimes call codominance. They are two different things. Incomplete dominance is more of a blending of genes where both genes sort of interact, and codominance is where if you have two different alleles for a gene, you will actually get both. One does not cover the other in the case of dominant and recessive. Multiple alleles is, for example, in blood type, where you don't just have big A, little a. In blood type, you have A, B, and O. So there's three alleles. And then we also understand that there are those sex-linked traits, those genes that can be dominant or recessive, but they are on the X chromosome. What is a pedigree chart? A pedigree chart is a chart of the genetic history of a family over several generations. It's sort of a family tree that tracks one trait at a time. Who has that trait? Who was a carrier for that trait? Scientists or genetic counselors would find out about your family. They would do a survey of who had what and who were your aunts and uncles. And then they would make this chart and they would color in the symbols to indicate who was actually a carrier or who actually had specific traits. And then from the patterns they see, they can also predict using Punnett squares what you might have. Now, I can guarantee you that most of this guy's brothers and sisters had black fur, yet his is white. And he has a autosomal recessive trait called albinism. So you might use big A to indicate normal and little a for a person that is an albino. He has no pigment in his skin or fur. In fact, almost all species can have albinism, including humans, including rabbits, birds. And albinism, we know, is a recessive trait because we can track its, pattern in a pedigree chart. For example, if you see in this pedigree chart, the symbols that are colored yellow indicate individuals with albinism, right? And you'll notice that the squares, which are males, do have, albinism, and there's females that have albinism. And you see some interesting patterns. For example, if both parents down here have albinism, all of their children have it. And you also see that up here are two pairs of parents that don't have albinism, yet they ended up producing children with the disease. So what does that mean? That's a pattern that we need to learn to interpret, okay? So if we start, we're heading towards understanding that big pedigree chart. We need to start with some basics. On a pedigree chart, females are always symbolized by circles, okay? Males are always squares. Now, connections are significant. A horizontal connection between two symbols indicates a married couple, when in fact they don't have to be married, but they mated and had offspring, okay? Whenever you have a vertical line connected to that horizontal line, that indicates that all of the offspring that are connected below that are siblings, okay? And that's important because each level of a pedigree chart, for example, if this was connected to this, is what we would call a generation. Kids, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and normally on a pedigree chart, as you go up in levels, the generations are the older generations, and the lower levels are younger. Now, as we said on those connections, there are some rare examples that you will see. Instead of having one line down, in the case of having two lines, but we know that both of these offspring are from the same pair of parents, this is how we indicate fraternal twins. Remember, normally you have mom and dad line, and then there's a bracket for all the brothers and sisters. And here we see two lines, fraternal twins. If there are two lines, both of the offspring are the same sex, and they are then connected. Okay, same sex horizontal connection. That indicates identical twins. So, when you put this all together, what does a pedigree chart really look like? And so again, we can see these generations. So who's the oldest generation? Is it 1, 2, or 3? Who's the oldest? And hopefully in your mind right now you're thinking 3 is the oldest generation because they're at the top. So we would say maybe 3. These are our grandparents. And then we have here parents. And then we have down here the grandchildren. Okay? There are some other symbols that you're going to want to pay attention to. Whenever you have a circle that is completely colored in, so this would be colored in black, that indicates that that individual is affected or they have that genetic trait. A circle with a dot in it indicates an X-linked trait, and that person is a carrier of it. So for example, Lorenzo, if he were on a pedigree chart, would look like this. Lorenzo's mom would look like this. And then in other cases, if it's an autosomal trait, you will see a half-colored shape. That means that this person is a carrier. And then if you see a line through it, that means that they're deceased. So if I wanted to draw Lorenzo's mom and dad, Lorenzo's dad would look like this, nothing in there. Lorenzo's mom would look like this, and then Lorenzo would be a square, but he would be colored all the way in because he is affected. Now, let's get into some more specifics on interpreting these pedigree charts. Your job is going to be to read these charts and determine if the pedigree chart shows an autosomal or X-linked disease. And there's an easy way to tell this. If most of the males in the pedigree affected, if they're mostly males, it's probably X-linked. If you remember, females often end up being carriers of X-linked traits. Males only need one copy, so they get it. Okay? If it's 50-50, men and women both get it, then it's an autosomal trait. Okay? So how about that one? That's a whopper. This is actually the